everyone online, and hello to everyone in the room today. It's really exciting to actually be present somewhere at a live event after so long, so thank you for coming out. As Ricardo said, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. I want to start by acknowledging that for thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'd also like to thank the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy for partnering with us on this event. I'd also like to thank the CBC for its support today as a sponsor. And thank you to CPAC. Those of you in the room today will see a few extra cameras. Thank you to CPAC for being here to record this conversation, which will be shown on the channel at a later date. So polarization in Canada and whether it poses a threat to Canadian democracy is a theme today. And don't worry, we're going to discuss whether there actually is polarization in Canada or not. But let me first say that the theme has a particular relevance for us at the IRPP. This year, the IRPP is turning 50. We were founded in 1972. And while our main activity is publishing in-depth research, we're also a convener. We've always been a convener. And we've convened conversations that feature very divergent viewpoints. I'll just tell you as one example. In the lead up to the 1995 sovereignty referendum in Quebec, the IRPP hosted several conversations between sovereigntists and federalists, really the definition of political polarization. But I think it's important for think tanks, not just the IRPP, but all independent think tanks, to support civil, constructive, inclusive conversations. People can and should hold divergent views in Canada, but really good public policy can emerge from that competition of ideas. And we can help advocate for evidence-based decision-making and healthy disagreements between all actors in the political sphere. So I want to not talk any further. I want to introduce our great, brilliant panel. Anita Lee, who's facing me here, is a longtime journalist, news entrepreneur, media consultant, and educator with over a decade of full-time experience as a multi-platform journalist at outlets across North America. Currently, she's the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of The Green Line, a hyperlocal Toronto-based news outlet that's launching on Friday. Okay, everybody take note of The Green Line. Eric Merkley is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He was the lead survey analyst of the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which studied the Canadian information ecosystem and public opinion during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Digital Democracy Project, which studied misinformation and public attitudes during the 2019 Canadian federal election. Hi, Eric. Daryl Bricker is a senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School and chief executive officer of Ipsos Public Affairs, the world's leading social and opinion research firm. Prior to joining Ipsos, he was director of public opinion research in the Office of the Prime Minister of Canada. And to my immediate right, Sean Spear is a senior fellow of the Munk School and project coordinator of the school's Ontario 360 research project. Sean is also currently the Scotiabank Fellow for Strategic Competitiveness at the Public Policy Forum, one of our fellow think tanks in the think tank world, and editor-at-large at The Hub, another platform that you should check out. He previously served as a senior economic advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So I just want to remind the online audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A module at the bottom of the screen, and people in the room, you'll also be able to ask a question a little later in the talk. We'll have a time for you to pose questions to the panel. My colleague Ji-Yoon is going to alternate between the room and also online. So I wanted to start maybe with you, Eric, and ask, what do we mean when we talk about polarization?
Yeah, but polarization, quite simply, is when citizens move towards the extremes. And that could mean a whole host of different things. All it is about gravitation towards the poles. Mostly, when we talk about it, we usually speak in terms of ideologies, movement towards the extreme left and the extreme right. By that metric, Canadians really haven't polarized that much. But there are other ways of talking about polarization, such as differences between the parties, ideological differences between, say, the Conservatives on the one side and the Liberals and the New Democrats on the other. We see a lot of evidence of that happening in Canada. But there are also non-ideological or non-policy-based definitions of polarization, specifically those that are about social identity. That is, what we see in the United States, for instance, is that the parties are becoming more deeply stratified and divided by things like race and religion and cultural questions that don't necessarily load on to left-right politics in the way we might think. And by that metric, we're not nearly as polarized in Canada. And then, you have populism, and there's all sorts of other questions where Canadians can be divided that aren't necessarily about left and right. And so polarization is very multifaceted, and we have to be careful when talking about it, because we may be polarizing on some dimensions and not on others.
Daryl, you're in public opinion research. What do you see in terms of different divisions or cleavages between Canadians, and would they qualify as polarization?
Well, I think the point that Eric made is really important. I think we in the current context, we really don't have a set of labels that accurately capture what's going on. So, left, right, for example, is usually very much associated with a version of class. When you look at the haves and the have-nots, we can go all the way back to the Greeks and take through Enlightenment and the way they structured the French Parliament and everything. We had these categories that seemed to work, and they don't really work as well anymore. I don't know that the differences of opinions have consolidated really into two sides. I think a lot of it is issues-based. Maybe over time we'll see it consolidate into two different sides to create a polarity as was described. But one of the things that's really different in Canada, and at Ipsos we look at public opinion all over the world, and the ascendant, I don't know if it's an ideology or perspective or flavor that's coming through in politics where we do see more polarization tends to be around a nativist populism. So it's sort of a populist political strategy, a populist orientation against elites, but there's also this sense that cultural change happening mostly as a result of immigration is really what is animating a fair amount of this debate. We're going to see some of it, for example, right now. There's an election coming up very soon in France, and it's very definitely an animating aspect of that. In Canada, the opinions are very different on issues like, for example, immigration. Canada, actually, we've seen over time that opinions about tolerance of immigration and tolerance of cultural change have actually gone up. So we're talking about something different in Canada. It's not that nativist populism that we're seeing in the United States, that we're seeing in France, that we're seeing in several European countries, even Central European countries. It's something else that's happening here. And I think really what it is just the recognition that now that we're not spending all of our time fighting over national unity, particularly the Quebec issue and the future of Quebec in Canada, what it's allowed to happen is differences of opinions to develop on some other dimension. It's something that people I don't think are necessarily used to. And good ones like what should be the size of the state, what other regions of the country may happen to think, whether we should have higher taxes, lower taxes for your trade or not. So it tends to be more of those types of policy differences that we have rather than, I would say, a polarity.
And what do you notice about this trend? Who is attached to that trend? I mean, what's the demographic?
It's really, really interesting because what we're seeing is that one would think that it's heavily regional. There's definitely regional aspects to it, but what we're seeing is an increasing division, I would say, based on generation. So one of the most interesting pieces of data that I've seen recently, series of data, is looking at two events that happened in Canada that were pretty much events that took place on the streets. The first one being the Black Lives Matter movement in, I guess, last year, and we saw a number of street protests and a lot of things happening. And then more recently, we saw the truckers' protest. The interesting thing to see in the data is that people who were most supportive of this method of protesting and of the agenda of both groups were basically the same people. And they were younger people, more precarious, people who were having a harder time getting started in life, having a hard time dealing with, I guess, realizing whatever their middle class dream is going to be in Canada. But it was really interesting. You would think that they would be completely divergent groups of people, but no, it was basically young people supporting both groups. Maybe because young people were so upset, and we saw this without exception, I'm sure Eric did too, that young people consistently were had more of a difficult time with what was happening during the pandemic in terms of the rules that were being applied and whether or not people should be allowed to go out. So there was more questions that were raised about that. But this is very interesting cleavage that I haven't, maybe back in 1968 there was something like that, but it's not something that I've seen in the time that I've been doing this, which is a pretty long time, that we're seeing this real generational divide starting to emerge.
Anita, you're nodding. So what have you noticed that aligns with what Daryl is saying?
Yeah, so I just want to set the context for polarization in a news media context. So I've been in the industry, worked at legacy publications as well as digital American media outlets for the better part of 2 decades. And polarization in the context of news media is really about how, I often say that news media set the table for conversation, for the types of conversations we have at home over dinner with our families, with our friends. And so we're increasingly seeing there's been debate about these notions of objectivity, and oftentimes, especially a place like CBC, which sets the status quo in terms of how news gathering happens, you have, the framing is oftentimes, he said, she said, or there's 2 major kind of parties that have disagreement. And what's increasingly happening is, I'm sure you guys can see this even when you open up your social media feeds and look at the headlines, that there's binary framing. And so the types of polarization that I've encountered have been really about binary framing of issues that actually require more nuanced and thoughtful debate. And it's those kind of details and intersections that really are the things that we should be looking at. But I actually love Daryl's research. It really validates a lot of the things that I've seen myself as somebody who runs a hyperlocal independent news outlet that services young Torontonians in particular. So the mission is we investigate the way we live to help young Torontonians survive and thrive in a rapidly changing city. And I actually developed this outlet precisely because I was noticing the same, anecdotally, qualitatively, noticing the same kind of just trends that were emerging, which is to say that my publication is not politically partisan. It's actually very values driven. And the reason for that is because I noticed that there's a commonality around just younger people feeling more economically precarious, that they're feeling more divided. There's a lot of research that shows that, particularly post-pandemic, that younger generations, Gen Zs and millennials, of which I am a part, are increasingly experiencing depression and anxiety at higher levels. And even within my friend circles, I know folks who have graduate degrees who are working in, for example, at Starbucks. And so that lends itself to just a lot of malcontent and discontent. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that there's more divisions generationally than politically.
Sean, what about urban-rural? I know you've done work on this in the past. Are we seeing some significant cleavages there, or is it more a generational question like Daryl was pointing out, or both?
Daryl talked about how polarization may manifest itself along these different dimensions. And as you said, the urban-rural question is one that I've spent some time thinking about, especially in the aftermath of the Trump election, which was described by some as the revenge of the places that didn't matter. And this question of place-based polarization matters to me personally because, I've spent most of my adult life in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver and New York and elsewhere. My family's in Northern Ontario. My parents and my brother live in Thunder Bay. My dad owns businesses in Atikokan. And so, I was motivated to understand, are there the seedlings for the kind of place-based polarization that seems to be shaping politics in other parts of the world? And I think the short answer is sort of. Research that we've published at the Public Policy Forum, along with Eric's colleague, Peter Lowen, the director here at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, finds that there are not fundamental differences between urban and rural Canadians, but there is as a matter of degree, particularly on questions that don't lend themselves to compromise. They're not technocratic questions where we can kind of saw the baby in half, like taxes or the size of government. It's questions around people's sense of economic security or people's sense of long-term opportunity. There is a difference between people living in places like Toronto and people living in places like Atikokan. Comfort with change, the type of cultural change that Daryl referred to. Again, as a matter of degree, people in big cities in Canada seem more capable of navigating the types of sociocultural changes that our country is going through. So that's a long way of saying, it seems to me the extent to which polarization is going to manifest itself increasingly in the coming years, the question of the urban-rural divide, I think, is one that policymakers and scholars and others ought to keep an eye on. We have our political system, the way it's designed, risks exacerbating those underlying differences between urban and rural Canadians. So, I think if the goal of political stability, social cohesion is at the top, the strength of our democracy is sort of top of mind, and I do think the question of the interplay between place and sense of one's future is one that we ought to be paying attention to.
So I'm going to come back to politics a little later, but maybe let's talk a little bit about the media, because the media can definitely make us feel that we're more divided. Eric, you've studied misinformation, you've studied the media ecosystem in Canada. We could argue that the media ecosystem in the United States has definitely created more cleavages, but there's Fox News, which is a major player. We don't have such an entity in Canada. Do you see some kind of similarities here in Canada, or is it completely different what we're dealing with on the media landscape?
I think it's a really tricky question to get at, because people that are already polarized are going to seek out partisan media and extreme media to begin with. So it's tricky to tease out the causal arrow of what direction it goes in. So even in the U.S., evidence about these vast echo chambers that exist where people only really see their own media, it's pretty overstated. Most Americans have broadly centrist news. There is a small chunk of very highly engaged partisans on each side that drive a lot of the traffic to these sorts of outlets, and they matter because they're politically engaged. They vote a lot in primaries and all this stuff, but they are a small number. In Canada, it's even more limited. Domestic partisan media, the degree to which people seek that out is very limited. That doesn't mean it can't emerge in the future. Canadians do exhibit patterns of selective exposure. They do want to pay attention to news content that conforms to their prior partisan or ideological commitments. But those outlets just don't exist. And so I don't really think it's a contributing factor to polarization in Canada. It's easy to think that because we all see what's going on social media. We see the negativity, we see the toxicity, and journalists have a tendency to use social media as a proxy for public opinion, that what's going on social media reflects the broader political landscape, when that's not true at all. Not only are social media users different, highly intense social media users are different still, especially those on Twitter. And so we have to take a step back, that what we see online isn't reflective of public opinion, that really toxic, angry, extreme people use social media as a way to magnify their views, but they were already that way to begin with. So is social media making things worse? Is the media environment making things worse? Probably. Perceptions of polarization matter. We tend to exaggerate differences with the other side. The media feeds that narrative by us versus them kind of frames for political issues. But the degree to which that's really true, driving all the patterns that we see, probably more limited than we think.
What about, anyone can answer this, but what about a sense of disenfranchisement that the media can create? So either by not including their voices. So I'm thinking the Freedom Convoy and the coverage around that. There's a lot of criticism around the way that the truckers were portrayed in mainstream media. But on the same side, not the same side, on another side, there are a lot of racialized persons, for example, that don't see themselves reflected in the media, don't see their stories told. And so there could be a kind of sense of being more and more separated from elites or just the media world in general. Mm-hmm. Does that, Anita, create, even more cleavages, not by explicitly splitting people, but by just not reflecting them at all?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on Eric's comment, and while I agree that there are, just to set the context, Canada is quite different from America. There are many different ecosystems within American media. There's a very strong ethnic media. There's right and left wing media. There's more centrist media. Canadian media is quite consolidated, and it is highly centralized, and especially among the legacy players. So there has been an emergence, especially in the last 5 to 10 years or so, of this independent media ecosystem that's emerging, that is striving to fill in gaps in coverage. And I still think that is valuable for the reason that there are underserved communities genuinely. Of course, nobody is made up of just one identity. You're not only your race or your gender, but there are definite communities, for example, First Nations, who have been historically underserved and have not been reflected by existing establishment media. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the criticisms of establishment media are not unwarranted. I do feel that not all of this is extreme kind of media that is tailored or pandering to a subset of disenfranchised folks. I do think there are a lot of fantastic community-driven outlets that are filling in gaps in coverage that are essential for a functioning democracy. My biggest concern is the fact that media is becoming so bifurcated that we don't have a shared truth, and that is something that is essential for a functioning democracy, which is why I've decided to create a more bipartisan outlet for young people in the city. Yeah.
Daryl, you have any thoughts about the media and how it might play into cleavages or not?
I think, I'm not going to pretend to be an analyst of the media, but what I will say is in terms of reflecting public opinion, you use the truckers' protest as an example. You would think that based on what you were watching on television, which is where I would see most of it, or what you were reading, that 99.9% of Canadians thought that this was an appalling thing, and that it was just terrible, out of control lawlessness. Well, I can tell you that when we were out doing polling, that's not what we were finding. We found that one of my favorite data points was we asked a question which was, okay, you may not necessarily agree with their tactics, but do you believe that their frustration is legitimate? So they're expressing a legitimate point of view. 46% of Canadians thought that. Now, do I think that 46% of the coverage that I saw on this reflected that legitimate frustration? I do not. So there are things that are happening out there in terms of, I would say, political reaction outside of Ottawa. And the Canadian media is incredibly, except for Quebec obviously, incredibly Ottawa and Toronto focused. And the growing part of our population are in the suburbs of the city of Toronto and in Western Canada. I don't think that fact is really reflected necessarily in the coverage that we see. Like Alberta is treated like it's sort of like the true Wild West. But maybe in some ways Alberta is a little bit more representative of where the country is headed than we think. Because if you take a look at their population growth of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, they're certainly leading Ontario and Quebec in terms of population growth in this country. They have a disproportionate share of immigration moves to those two places. So there's something that's happening out there that I don't think is being necessarily reflected in the media coverage, at least that I see. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what the solution is to that. I'm not going to pretend to be a media analyst. But when I saw that, as I said before, 46% of the population sympathizing with that point of view, I certainly didn't feel that that was being reflected in what I was seeing.
May I just say something about
Yes.
this? You mentioned that I worked for Prime Minister Harper and spent some time in and around Ottawa. And again, motivated in large part by the Trump presidency, I've come to think a lot about the question of the representativeness and responsiveness of our politics, of the media, and so on. And the extent to which the motivation behind this rise of populism is this sense that our politics and our mainstream institutions are insufficiently representative and responsive. And where I think the media deserves some criticism is that the media laments the lack of, laments the tendency towards a strict partisanship in Ottawa, the tendency towards caucus discipline, and so on. But whenever a parliamentarian or a politician breaks from party lines or breaks from his or her party ranks on a different issue, rather than treating it like just a natural development in a pluralistic representative democracy, it's instead reported as a sign that the leader has lost control of his or her caucus, that there is chaos and disorder. And so that, in effect, leads to the kind of top-down discipline, and in turn, limits the kind of expression of the representativeness and responsiveness that I think is important for people to feel like they have a voice. And so, if I had one, if there was one thing I think the media could do to kind of enable a greater representative responsiveness is to report on the differences, not just amongst parties, but within parties, like Eric mentioned earlier.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think this kind of leads to an important point. As I mentioned, the parties have become more polarized, and supporters of the parties have become more polarized ideologically over time. This is especially true among political elites, among people that are really interested in politics. And this includes journalists, it includes politicians themselves. And so that'll affect how news articles are framed, that it's about left versus right. And so it's hard when you see system-level dissatisfaction out there that might not take on an ideological flavor. There's a tendency for journalists to kind of fit it into the narrative of left versus right, or government versus opposition, or Trump versus everyone else, when that might not actually be the case. So I think it gets to important. Not everything kind of boils down to left versus right, or that. There might be other factors at work, and journalists should be a bit more attuned to that in their reporting.
I'd just love to add something. I completely agree with that, because I find that there's been a politicization of every single issue to the point where it's very heuristics based. So you can, if somebody appears a certain way, or if they say a certain keyword or a certain term, or that they're boxed or they're categorized as being left or right. But I feel like the Overton window has shifted to the extent that right and left are increasingly meaningless, especially, I mean, this is obviously anecdotal. This is I'm somebody who's an educator who teaches younger journalists, and I also engage with young people quite frequently. And oftentimes when I hear young people talk about politics, it is often it's more issue-based as opposed to having necessarily party allegiance, aside from outside of what you were saying, which is unless they're like a political leader, they're really engaged in politics. So that is definitely something that I'm trying to mitigate through the work that I'm doing, and moving towards this idea of values-based journalism, which is increasingly seen, especially among community outlets. And values-based journalism, essentially just being very transparent about the values that you care about. So like funding transparency, showing how you conduct news gathering, for example. And so those are signals of, I'd say, authenticity, or at least trust to members of the news consuming public.
So what could we expect to see? Daryl, Daryl's talked about where there's divisions isn't the right word, but emerging issues in your data. Where could we see political parties capitalizing on that?
That element of frustration, I mean, this is where you wonder if it's a longer term trend that's just starting, or whether it's just an episode. And that's why it's difficult when you're in one of these transition periods to actually nail down what we're looking at. But there's something going on these days with the middle class dream in Canada. There's something really difficult emerging around that. And it's generation based. One of I think the iconic elements of it is the issue of housing. I think the housing issue, disproportionately when we talk about housing, I think in housing circles, people who are interested in housing issues are really talking about how we deal with low-income housing in downtown Toronto, or we deal with homelessness. Both really important issues. But what we're seeing in the polling is that it's really more kind of the middle class aspiration towards housing, the idea of being able to get your own suburban castle, as being part of your
Or Thunder Bay.
or Thunder Bay Castle, but disproportionately in Canada, because 90% of our population growth in the last 20 years has been in car commuting suburbs around major cities, the ability to be able to achieve that. And you have a group of people who feel like they're okay on that and are actually enjoying this situation. They tend to be older. They have had established careers. They've had successful lives. And then you've got another group of people who've been raised to believe that that's what they should be aspiring to, particularly new Canadians who come to this marketplace, because we think that people who are immigrants to Canada or refugees is actually a small portion of the people who are coming here. Most people are coming here with assets and abilities, and they're buying into the same middle class dream that's continued to be sold since the end of the Second World War in this country, and it's getting harder and harder and harder for them. So I think that there's an emerging cleavage on this issue of the people who are established and the people who are trying to make it. And it's interesting to see that it's disproportionately the young population who back in 2015 backed Justin Trudeau and backed the progressive option. I'm wondering if they're going to start considering not just progressive options, but conservative options. Somebody who's going to be able to speak to the ability of somebody to realize what we consider to be success in our lives, whether they can start their families, they can buy the assets that they want to have, they'll have the retirement that they think other people have had, that they believe that they're entitled to. There's this real, I think, cleavage between those two groups. And I don't think it's ideological. I think that's why that data jumped off on me on Black Lives Matter and the truckers. It's frustration. It's just that sense that this is not working for me. So who's going to be able to capitalize on that? It's not a class-based argument, not in the way we would typically look at it. So who is it? I'm not really sure, but it's a really interesting thing that's emerging.
Now, Sean, you talked about Prime Minister Harper, and I personally can't stand when people compare elections, because I think that...
Oh, we won't then. Okay.
Well, because I always think every election is different groups of people. Mr. Harper created a minimum winning coalition bringing together all kinds of disparate groups in Canada. So, I mean, and this has been researched quite a bit, but bringing together different cultural communities and people who lived in the suburbs and women, and and created this winning formula. What would that look like now? It's obviously not the same people. We're talking about different generation, and we're in the middle of a Conservative Party race. Is there, are there some considerations with somebody who might, take a more populist tack to win first the leadership and then perhaps get to 24 Sussex?
Yeah, I think thus far in the leadership race and just more generally in discourse about Canadian politics and the Conservative Party, there's a tendency to focus on the question of how can a Conservative Party leader maintain support from core Conservative Party members, and at the same time appeal to a broader share of the Canadian population. And it seems to me that different candidates are sort of positioning different approaches to trying to answer that question. The group that I am intrigued by in Canadian politics is the 37.5% of Canadians who didn't vote in 2021. So rather than thinking about the Canadian electorate as a kind of fixed pie distributed amongst the different parties and trying to answer the question, how do you bring some part of this fixed pie over to your sides? I think one thing Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party did in 2015 is they enlarged the pie through a combination of narrative and different policy choices. They were able to bring people from outside of mainstream politics into the electoral system. And it's worth noting that if non-voters in 2021 were a single political party, it would have been the biggest party in terms of the election outcome. And so if I was advising one of the leaders, which I'm not, one of the leadership candidates, which I'm not, I would spend as much time thinking about non-voters as I would be about the right set of messages and policies to attract voters who might have voted for the Liberal Party or the Green Party, the Democrats, or even the People's Party in 2021.
Anita, did you have anything to add on what you're seeing from the people that in your constituency that was working with the Green Line and where they align politically, perhaps, or some of the issues that they're concerned with?
Just in terms of my target audience. So, I mean, just some of the issues that Daryl brought up, just fundamental life issues. So, housing affordability, food access, for example, mental health issues are something that we're seeing across the board in terms of the target audiences to be served, which are young and other underrepresented people. And by underrepresented, I just mean folks who identify as being part of news deserts, which are underserved geographic areas, like, you know, my hometown of Scarborough, which is a suburb of Toronto, as well as identity-based underserved communities, but also other underserved communities. So, for example, if you're a military veteran or you're somebody who's formerly incarcerated, you have a very distinct experience, which not a lot of people might understand. So we're trying to fill in those gaps in a local way. But in terms of the way we're actually serving these communities, we actually are using a framework that is becoming more popular among community-driven outlets, which is actually Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And of course, I'm not a psychology teacher, but it is a very helpful kind of framework for serving people from a values-driven perspective that's like apolitical, in the sense that you are able to serve, you know, address people's physiological needs all the way up to, you know, if you're somebody who's more resourced and just, I guess, grounded, you're able to support other members of your community. And so that's kind of the framework that is emerging and becoming more popular, at least among local media outlets that I've seen in North America.
I'm going to go to questions. I'm just going to wrap up with one question, Eric. We talk. I mean, the title of this event is whether there's a threat to democracy. I think we've established that there really, you know, isn't a dire polarization in Canada. But why is it that we fear that something could happen to our democracy? Is it because certain people will not want to be in the public sphere because the sphere is too volatile or hostile? Or is it that somebody's going to clamp down on our rights if for example, if there's a very populist prime minister that comes to power?
Yeah, I think we fear a democratic threat because of what we see in the United States. And there's a tendency whenever to talk about polarization in Canada to make reference to the United States and to kind of impute everything that's going down there up here. And then there are very concerning things happening in the United States in terms of the democratic stability, rolling back of voting rights by Republicans, especially at the state level, a kind of a sense that the stakes of political conflict are just so high and intense, where the partisan camps are socially stratified, as I said, by race and religion, and an erosion of democratic norms, where, you know, we see large numbers of Americans endorse political violence and you know, the overturning of free and fair elections. But there's no signs that this is a thing that's happening in Canada whatsoever. In terms of when you poll people on these sorts of questions, there's a fair amount of confidence with the system, muted confidence, but confidence nonetheless, and one that doesn't deeply divide the parties. And a key factor is just institutions are different here than in the United States. They are perhaps better placed to manage polarized conflict over time. Everything gets kind of locked, you know, shutdowns of Congress, inability to pass legislation. It breeds a lot of frustration in the United States. Here you have the changeover of parties in power. They're able to pass the policy that they promised. There's less grounds for frustration in Canada on those fronts. So institutional differences matter, and elite differences matter too. Conservative elites don't have the same incentives as Republican elites in the United States. They need to bring more people into the fold in order to win elections, whereas Republicans can hold on to their advantage in the Senate and the gerrymandered House and in the Electoral College. So it's night and day differences in terms of institutional structure between Canada and the U.S. We can't look down there and say it's happening here the evidence just isn't there.
Thank you. So there's a mic here for people in the audience in Toronto, but I'll go to online questions first. Yoon, if you have one that you want to read to us.
Sure. So several people have asked, is first past the post regime a reason for polarization? And would proportional representation address the perception of polarization?
Maybe I'll start. I don't know if PR would, the impact of PR on polarization, but I would say that, that I think it would help to address the issue I raised earlier, which is the representativeness and responsiveness of our political system. I take everything that Eric said about the difference between Canada and the US, but our preference on the efficiency of our political system, I think risks coming at the expense of the representativeness and responsiveness of our system. These large brokerage parties that we have a lot of strengths, but one of the negative aspects is there are a lot of political views and political preferences among Canadians that really don't get expression. And I worry a bit, Jennifer, that especially in recent years, that the failure of our political system to bring expression to those types of ideas and values and preferences end up going kind of boom through the whole political system. And so a PR would be messier. It might even be more unedifying at times. But I think on balance, the trade-off may be worth it to sort of give people confidence that our system is able to account for the kind of inherent pluralism of Canadian society.
We could see, with a PR system, we would see a People's Party of Canada representative in the House of Commons, and some people would be uncomfortable with that, but it would give some, I guess, air some of those points of view. As much as we might be uncomfortable with them, it would give voice to a certain, I guess, percentage of the population.
Exactly, and it would ostensibly have a counterpart on the left, where a lot of progressives feel like their values and perspectives aren't necessarily represented in our form of brokerage politics, which is accentuated by the first past the post system. I wonder if the messiness caused by PR actually kind of counterintuitively produces more political stability over the long term by bringing those voices and perspective into the mainstream as opposed to leaving them on the margins of our political discourse.
Very interesting. Is there a next question to you?
Sure. So Mark asked, is the Conservative leadership campaign a bellwether for the question of polarization?
I really don't think so. First of all, I agree with Eric. I mean, because people disagree on things doesn't mean that they're polarized. And one of the things that we have in Canada is this kind of, this, as John Ebbetson and I described in The Big Shift, this idea, this Laurentian consensus in which we have a very narrow view of what is an acceptable disagreement. And that this used to be among both the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, and the NDP too. They rode a very, very narrow rail through Canadian history, and mainly because of the fact that we were always struggling with the issue of national unity. So what we're seeing as we've come out of that is that people are actually starting to disagree in the way that you see in other mature democracies on issues like public finance and trade and military issues and all sorts of other things, because we're not so dominated by this other issue. And I think that even though we've gone in that direction, the types of degrees of difference between people who are going to be participating in this Conservative leadership campaign in terms of the fundamentals of Canadian public policy and democracy are not going to be wildly different. There's nobody in this campaign who has a chance of possibly winning who's going to advocate for privatizing the Canadian healthcare system. There's nobody who's participating in this who's going to advocate for scrapping free trade with the United States. There's nobody in this, and just pick whatever public policy issue that's already been decided in Canada that's kind of a mainstream political opinion or public policy opinion. There's nobody who's really going to fundamentally challenge it. Yeah, there's going to be a few fireworks and there's going to be a few symbolic things or whatever, but the bottom line in this entire race, and this goes for any of the political parties, if they're having a leadership race, is somebody has to be able to assemble a winning coalition. And you don't do it with wedges. You can only do it by expanding whatever it is that you're trying to do. Canadian politics is very simple. Sean and I were talking about this the other day. It's very, very simple, but different from what it used to be. Simple. When the suburbs side with the downtown, progressives win. When the suburbs decide that they're going to side with the rural and smaller town parts of the country, conservatives win. So the question is, how do you appeal to suburban voters? They're not extremists in any form. Lots of new Canadians, striving middle-class families who are just trying to get by. That's the sweet spot in the electoral political system. They're not sitting around talking about, you know, big ideological questions that conservative think tankers are talking about. They could care less. They want somebody who's going to be able to deal with that problem of frustration, who's going to give them access to what they thought they bought into when they came to Canada or they were raised in Canada. That's what they're looking for. Anything else is a complete waste of oxygen. And so the conservative leader who's able to figure that out, as Stephen Harper did in his own way, is the one who's going to be successful in the next election campaign. And the next election campaign is going to be a change election. People are going to be looking for a difference, particularly after they've lived through 3.5 years of a Liberal and NDP coalition. It's just the way the political system works in this country. So I think anybody who goes down an extremist path in this Conservative leadership campaign will not be able to hold the Conservative coalition together and certainly won't be able to grow it. So I expect that maybe we're going to see a few fireworks and a few interesting things, but nothing fundamental.
So the next question is from Jillian from online, and she has a question specifically for Daryl. She says, it is very interesting to hear the demographic commonalities among those supporting two very different situations. One trend we have been seeing emerge as well as is that older generations, perhaps lacking digital literacy, are also increasingly getting wrapped up in movements like the trucker protests that might promote conspiracy theories. Have you noticed this trend, and does it appear to across different movements?
No, we really didn't see that. It was interesting. That's a really good question. What was really interesting in those data on the trucker protest and Black Lives Matter was where the older population coalesced was on the issue of law and order. So they saw this through a lens that was about public order. The younger population saw it as a very different thing. They saw it as about frustration and disagreement and a legitimate way to demonstrate your frustration and your disagreement with what the situation was. So that's where the older and the younger generation seemed to separate. The older folks, it was, you should not be doing any of this. This is not how we do things.
You're nodding, Anita.
Oh, I just find it fascinating. But I also just wanted to say that, just to the previous point about the suburbanites, it resonates so much with me in particular, because I grew up in a suburb, and that is decidedly how, like, the way my father talks about this country very much. Play by the rules, like just achieve and like focus on, you know, building a life for us in Canada. And I think it's interesting because I diverge slightly from my father's perspective, but I think that's actually quite a common, I guess, phenomenon, at least among my friends as well. So nothing, you know, more to contribute beyond that, but I just find it very resonant, actually. Yeah.
All right. Ji-Yoon, is there another question online?
We have one in the audience.
Or is there one in the audience? Don't be shy. Go ahead. There's a microphone there, and there's a microphone there.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah, my question, I guess, kind of ties on a few of the themes that have been brought up. Because earlier, the generational divide in the polarization. There was talk earlier about how that's maybe tied as well to housing, and I can definitely see why. I'm not entirely convinced that maybe that's the whole story. I think there's like a number of different things.
Oh, it's not, I agree. Yeah.
So, yeah, for example, like first thing that comes to mind for me as well is like climate change. Seeing like a lot of youth pushing for fundamental change, feeling maybe like older generations have left them in a certain scenario. Similar thing I think of with COVID, for example, students that are taking classes online or leaving university and struggling to find jobs, probably also tied to the asset problem. But fundamentally, I guess my question is about the generational divide and how you think we can try and mend this a little bit. I know that media is a little bit difficult. It can take time to create that cultural change, but even things like this, we have a pretty intergenerational room right now. How do you think we can try and move forward and bring different generations together to maybe share those opinions so we can grow together?
That's a really good question.
Maybe I'll just, first of all, recognize that we always have great questions from Monk students here.
Yes, excellent.
Not the online questions weren't great too.
To the extent that I have an answer to Juan Carlos' question, I think there's a fascinating and yet underreported generational change occurring in our politics, and I'm not quite sure what the consequences will be, but viewers won't be surprised to hear that I'm most familiar with this occurring within conservative politics, though of course I'm sure it's manifesting itself in progressive politics as well. But just a couple of stats. 49% of federal conservative MPs were elected in 2019 or 2021. More than half of the shadow cabinet presently is millennial or on the margins of being millennial. And it's just fascinating to think about what that may mean for the issues, priorities, perspectives that manifest themselves in conservative politics. This is a generation that didn't come of age during the big battles about the role of the government in the economy of the late 1970s and 1980s. These are people who are more familiar and committed to questions around climate change, like was mentioned. I think questions around identity and culture, which really are not part of the baby boom generation's politics. So I think it's too early to tell. And what's interesting about what this all means, and what's interesting is this millennial caucus, as I've described it within conservative politics, doesn't have a self-image, I think, as a generational cohort. It still sees itself along ideological or regional lines. But to the extent to which it starts to bring expression to a particular generational perspective, I think it could be really powerful. And we may be on the cusp of a kind of change in the conversation shaped by just who's around the table and who's represented in Parliament.
Well, Eric, I'm going to take some more questions from the room, but on climate change, I mean, our politicians would like us to think that we're split left-right, but there's many conservatives are for carbon pricing, for example, but we don't always see it portrayed that way.
That's true across a whole number of issues. And the reality is that conservatives themselves are divided on a whole number of questions. Carbon taxes, anything to do with climate change. We saw the same thing about vaccine mandates for COVID-19, vaccination and the like. Those are deep divisions within the Conservative Party and conservative voters. There's a tendency in media coverage of the environment to just, conservatives are climate deniers, and that's that. But there's a lot of conservative voters that think it's an important issue, especially among younger generations. And as there is generational change, and as there are issues that are underserved by kind of current left-right politics, like housing prices and the like, some political entrepreneurs are going to take advantage of that and try to bring those issues into the fold because there's a political upside to do so. This has happened throughout Canadian history, where you've had certain issues, certain tensions that boil over that the current party system isn't able to grapple with effectively. So that this happens again and again, and we might be seeing it here. But to the age of the Conservative caucus, I think it speaks to that change that's happening. It's not a gentrocracy like in the United States, where everybody's over the age of 70, it seems, in Congress. So I think I'm optimistic about the future in that sense, even though change might not come as quickly as we might like.
I'd love to add to actually that. And that's a great question, and I think about it a lot. But I find that, just to reiterate something that Sean said, which is like there's effectively a changing of the guard in terms of who's at the table, and there's a lot of younger leadership that is really invested in issues of climate. And I find, so somebody we interviewed at the Green Line was the Fridays for Future Toronto lead, Ali Rougeau, and I know her mother personally, and I know, like, her mother has told me that I know this sounds very simple, but like the fact that her daughter's invested in this issue was the way that she was able to become more invested in herself. So it's not as if these generations are completely divided. In fact, they often live in the same household. So I think organically, my hope at least is organically that this, some sort of consensus will emerge. I don't think we're that generationally divided, although there are obviously differences.
So we have a few more minutes, so we'll do like rapid fire 2 questions from the room and then wrap up. I'm trying to remember which side. Here.
Thank you. So my question is about the Emergencies Act. Do you think its use by the federal government will have any long-term or medium-term implications for Canadian democracy and polarization? Or do you think it's just kind of a one-off event that won't have too many repercussions? And also, is it going to lead other social movements to express their views in that way? And what will be the kind of general consequences or non-consequences of the use of the Emergencies Act?
Sean?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've seen instances, for instance, of groups raise concerns that the implicit consent or permission to the trucker convoy contrasted with instances where other groups have protested issues and the state intervened with considerable force much faster than we saw in Ottawa. So I don't know about the Emergencies Act question per se, but I do think the trucker convoy experience will be with us for some time, and it'll certainly be pointed to in the future when other groups, say ones with progressive views or priorities, find themselves in a similar position.
Yeah, I would say when you look at how the public responded to it, the preference was for public order and whatever needed to be done in order to create public order. The public was all right with it, but they did not translate that into support for the way that the government managed the protest, and it did not reflect well on the Prime Minister. His numbers around this were not good at all. So even though the act of dealing with the protest, people wanted to see something done, the leadership of the government on dealing with the protest did not go down well with Canadians. Now the question is, there's going to be lawsuits, and there's going to be, who knows what else is going to come out of this. And when the next incident comes up, somebody decides they want to shut down some part of, fundamental infrastructure in the country, that'll be the real test to see what endures here. But it was nobody came out of that looking well. The people who are on any side of this, all of them came out of it with damage. The one who paid the biggest price for this was Aaron O'Toole, who's no longer leader of the Conservative Party. But the Prime Minister...
And Ottawa's chief of police. But
yeah, and Ottawa's chief of police. And the Prime Minister, it left a mark. Whether it'll have an effect longer term, who knows, but it did not go down well.
So I'll ask the two of you to ask your questions 1, 2, and then we'll answer them, and then we will unfortunately have to wrap up.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. So one thing that got brought up was this idea that our ideas about polarization are kind of imported from the United States and all that, democratic backsliding, the violence. And so while there are real issues that, you've discussed that Canadians are polarized over, to what extent do you see this as one of our periodic Canadian crises of sort of elite worry about the weakness of Canadian identity, that we seem to like to have these every 20 years, and I'm wondering if that's sort of the underlying theme.
You should have said 20 minutes. I absolutely see it as that. It's funny. People who are in kind of elite political business positions, and they just can't understand that people might actually disagree with them, and that people might actually disagree. That's what politics is. That's what public policy is. It's about offering up different options and people not fighting it out, but debating it out, just as they do at the Public Policy Forum, which does a great job on this. That's a fantastic reminder.
And the
about-
IRPP.
Yes, no, I meant the IRPP, sorry about that.
I
But
knew you did.
I know, but that was a really good reminder. There are civil ways to do this, but you know what? It's people don't have to be extremists to disagree. We actually disagree, and it's the way it's supposed to work. It's messy, but it's a good thing.
My question has to do with the truckers' convoy. Isn't the assault on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2021 a better analogy for that, even though that was far more violent, to be sure, but in terms of the message, the racial composition in particular, because it was, they both were an all-white crowd, and they were basically assaulting the legislature, the federal legislature of their respective countries. Isn't that a better analogy? And what is the issue of race? What has that got to do with the issue of polarization in Canada today? And how can we create a more integrated and inclusive polity where different ethnicities and panels like this and schools like this are more representative of our increasingly diverse society, given the fact that if you look at our writers in the Globe and Mail, 98% white. You look at Canadian social science, I'd say well over 95% white. You look at people at the PMO, similar to that. And so that's the one side of it. And I think that is a key issue of dealing with polarization, is making sure we all feel like Canadians, as opposed to people of color, newcomer, disadvantaged, and so on and so forth, and reserving the real Canadianness for white folks who write the op-eds and who create the thinking that animates our polity. That's the question.
Thank you. It's a great question. I could talk to you about that for hours. Anyone have something to say? Yeah. Eric?
I think we've been fortunate to avoid a lot of the worst excesses of this that we see in the United States, in the sense that that there isn't as much stratification among our political parties on issues of race and ethnicity. That is, it's not a really clear driver of having a partisan identity or having an ideological identity. And perhaps because of that, we see a lot more muted forms of polarization in Canada. We may dislike our political opponents more now than in the past, but that's not very intense. We're not willing to socially wall ourselves off from people that disagree with us. This gets to Daryl's point about that polarization isn't necessarily a bad thing. The fact that the parties are more ideologically charged than in the past is not necessarily a bad thing. Parties can disagree, people can disagree, and the fact that we've avoided that sort of social identity component that's infected American politics, I think, is a really good thing. That's not to say that there aren't problematic signs. Parties have a lot of power in the sense that they can attract voters into their coalition, and they can persuade their own supporters to take certain policy stances. And so to the extent that conservative elites embrace kind of far-right ideology or anti-immigrant ideology, that would be very troubling if that were to happen. And it happened to the Republican Party. The nativist turn post-George W. Bush we see the effects of it, and it's not going to change anytime soon. It could happen in Canada, but I doubt it. Again, elite incentives are different. There's no gains to be had for conservative elites to embrace that sort of rhetoric because they need to win seats in the 905 and in Metro Vancouver. So I think I'm a bit more optimistic on the state of Canadian polarization from that sort of angle.
I'd also like to respond to that. I'm glad, I don't know who, I can't see the person anymore, but thank you for asking that question. I would say from a news media perspective, I think I can talk you through how I've grappled with this, because I think it's somewhat complex. I co-founded an organization called Canadian Journalists of Color because I saw the very thing that you were observing, which is it was effectively an advocacy group that really tried to push the industry to diversify internally their newsrooms, but also the sources that they interview. Because I do think, although I think we are all very intersectional and we are not just one identity, I'm not just somebody who's an Asian person, I do think it would be remiss to say that there are not shared experiences as a result of your race. So for example, Black communities who are over-policed and First Nations, of course, as we know. So I think for me, I think it's important for us to get to a position where there is a plurality of perspectives and that people do feel like they have a voice at the table. And I do think it's important for us to ultimately kind of shed these divisions. I mean, I'm not trying to, talk about a utopian ideal society, but I do think it's important. The reason why I ended up going from creating CJOC to creating the Green Line, which is bipartisan, is inclusive of everybody, is because I think the next phase of this, after we're surfacing a lot of these really problematic systemic issues, is to be more solutions oriented and to come together to reassess existing frameworks. And I think that's something that I think Canada has, especially in the last few years, I'm more heartened and I'm more optimistic that we're moving towards that. And I've often said that we have a lot of soft power, and there's a lot of other countries around the world that are experiencing increased migration and are becoming more pluralistic in terms of the makeup of their demographics. So we can set an example for other countries around the world, and I really do believe that. So hopefully I was able to convey the complexity of that, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Anita, Eric, Daryl, and Sean. Thank you to the Monk School for partnering with us on this event. To everybody who came out today in person, that was fantastic, and your questions online and in person. Thanks to the CBC for its support today, really appreciated. If you're watching online, you will have gotten a link for an evaluation form. Please fill that out, because we'll improve every event when you give us your input. And I want to signal that we have another great conversation coming up on Friday at McMaster University on how policymakers can support responsible and inclusive innovation in healthcare technology. So you can watch that online, or you can come out to McMaster in person. And we'll be traveling to a number of other universities this year for similar conversations. If you want to continue watching or even come and participate in person, just check it out on irpp.org. And for those of you who are here with us today, we have a networking reception in the South House Lounge adjacent to this room. So I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.